This week, we're going to talk about observation ethnography, which is where you're not just talking to people, you're also observing what's happening. In the case of observation, you're not interacting usually much with the people you're observing. With ethnography, it's often a combination of observing, talking, and doing other things to give a whole picture of a community. But to get us going, let's start with observation. So, as we talk about with observation and ethnography, we're going to look at how, by looking carefully at what's going on in a situation, a community, even a single area, you can understand more about what's happening in the world. Let's start with observation. The overview is this. The basic definition is you carefully watch people, usually in a natural setting that is one that you haven't created or manipulated, over a period of time in order to learn about their patterns of interaction and behavior. You collect mostly qualitative data, but occasionally quantitative. You can measure the percentage of people passing by doing some activity, as William White did. The percentage of the number of women talking on phones and walking alone, those in groups, etc. You're usually observing groups to watch nuances of interaction, behavior over time. At a work site, you might observe how friendships form over time, looking at the dynamics of how people pair up. Ethnography, on the other hand, is a more participant aspect. It's related to observation, but it involves immersion in a culture or a subculture, where observation is more detached, often invisible. Ethnographers are engaged with those they're observing, making sure that they understand through their own participation what people are thinking, what's happening, and often seeing those dynamics. Ethnographers observe usually not one space, but as many places as a subculture extends to. You want to understand where people are within that subculture, so you'll work with them and live with them and play with them as much as you can to understand the full aspect of how a culture, subculture extends its community. Ethnography will often combine observation with qualitative interviews, looking at any available documents that are part of the community and any other resources to give you an idea of what's happening. Often you'll see either tool used with applied research, but especially observation. Ethnography is less common, but you'll often see observation for understanding what's happening in a classroom, in a work site, all sorts of areas to understand if a policy program is working, what could improve things, and so on. Especially with children. Since children are not always the best reporters in interviews, observation can often help, since they often don't articulate their thoughts and feelings as clearly. But observing, you're much more likely to see what are the real dynamics of what's happening. Now let's talk about methodology. Like interviews, generally, observation, and especially ethnography, is based on interpretivist methodology. What we remembered was often more about what the meaning of the situation is, rather than trying to get some objective, causality going on. You want to understand what's the association of different people with different views on the world. You're trying to ultimately understand the world through somebody else's eyes. You need trust and rapport, and you have to have that trust that you're not going to disrupt their lives or betray them somehow. And it's partly a collaborative project. They will often understand at least somewhat of what you're trying to get at, and hopefully sharing their culture and community so you understand what's going on. And as with interviews, but often even more so, data collection is concurrent with analysis. As you notice patterns, it may alter your focus. Now, looking at observations, what kind of research questions make the most sense? It's especially good for studying behavior people might not admit verbally or even are unaware of. You can often look at the sequence of events because while people will remember somewhat what happens, they often don't always keep track of A happened, then B happened, then C happened. You can see that much more directly with observation. And if you are in an applied research situation or just looking more broadly at society on how a policy change affected life, you're able to observe before a policy change is made and then afterwards and compare how the change changed the dynamics within that space. You also can see interactional patterns, especially nonverbal behaviors, the routine actions people are barely aware of or are embarrassed about. Now with ethnography, the research questions are sometimes deeper. They're more expansive options for research with observations, since you're trying to look at a whole community and all of the dynamics over time and sometimes over space. Ultimately, your unit of analysis is not just individuals as with surveys or even most interviews, but a whole culture, looking at a community as a whole or a subculture as a whole to understand the broader dynamics, the norms, the behavior within a culture. So what's the literature review you do before observation or ethnography? First of all, looking at what other people have looked at, understanding other spaces that other researchers, it can help you choose a location or a group for observing, both because it's similar to something you see in the literature or because it's different in some ways, but same enough that you can sort of compare the results of a different culture or a different group compared to what had already been observed or where there had been observation or ethnography done. You want to learn the patterns of behavior of those similar groups that you'll observe. That can understand how the patterns that were observed in different groups differ. And so you can look for similarities and commonalities with different groups that have been observed. It can help you operationalize what you observe, since if people have seen similar patterns, you can look for them as you code your results. And it'll sensitize you to behavior you might overlook, or you might even deem insignificant if you hadn't been clued in that something was very important. It'll also help you write up your research, especially with ethnography. There are many styles of how to write up a long-term experience, like an ethnographic participation in a community. Now, the ethics here. With observations in public places, you don't even need informed consent. They're doing it in public, so you can write about it. Informed consent is needed if you want access to semi-private or completely private places. And the consent requires describing your research topic, who will be observed, how it'll be used, how long the research might take, noting that participation is voluntary and confidential, and if there are any risks to participants, and also just contact info on if they have any questions. With children, you need the consent of parents, and when reporting results, you need to protect the location of the observations to make sure that people who are assured of confidentiality, that the location isn't given away. Now, with observation, how do you sample? The biggest decision in observation is obviously where to observe. It's usually going to be in one location. It's affected by questions of access, the theoretical appropriateness, and can you do it? Is it feasible? Now, you often want to be careful about the days and times you do for observation, since the behaviors you want to observe may vary based on the time of day or the day of the week. So you may actually want to randomly pick a time, or you may have a theoretical reason for looking at a particular time or a particular day. And you have to choose which interactions or behaviors to focus on, because no matter how you think you know what you want to look at, there's a lot always going on. And in any scene, there's so many things to focus on that you have to narrow it down in some way. With ethnography, it has one sampling decision. What is the group you want to observe? Once you make that decision, almost everything else will flow. The group you want to observe may be based on some kind of theory, and also who you can actually get access to that fits that choice. Now let's talk about the Peter Adler piece, the promise and pitfalls of going into the field. They're trying to talk deeply about what it means to do ethnography. And the biggest question is, how can readers know if researchers have gotten the evidence and the interpretation right? Because with ethnography, if you've been in the field for a year, 2 years, sometimes more, it's going to be very hard for anybody to repeat the experience. And even if they go into the same community, they're going in at a different time period, and they often aren't going to know where your community is because you've given confidentiality. So repeatability is hard, so they have to actually trust the ethnographer. What kind of stories should we believe from an ethnographer? How can we know that it's credible? And here's the question. There's ethnography, which is one kind of way of telling a story. There's journalism, and some ethnography can seem to be similar to journalism, especially a long piece journalism that goes in depth. And for another comparison, there's literature, which is stories told, maybe fictional, but often based on similar experience of somebody within a community. The big difference is ethnography requires systematic, long-term gathering of data. You have to engage existing theories of human behavior rather than just simply reporting what you see without much theory behind it. And you're often looking for the social trends and patterns rather than the character development, which might be true of literature, where it's more about the individuals within a setting rather than how the setting as a whole operates. Not that there isn't aspects of ethnography, of sociology within much literature. When you see, Pride and Prejudice, you see a whole community and there are more is described through literature. But most literature is actually far more personalistic, and it definitely isn't often based on the same careful patterns and looking for how it fits into social theory. Let's talk about data gathering. If you have superficial relationships, and especially in ethnography, you're going to have superficial insights. The tough part of ethnography is you have to gain the trust, and that requires highly developed social skills. You have to build intimacy and a commitment over time, and by demonstrating that commitment to the community you're within, just by being there, it often will make people open up. There's an aspect of autobiography when doing ethnography, but there's also the more general approach of talking to others who have gone through similar traumas or events to find out what's happened. And here's the deal. When you evaluate ethnography, readers will pay attention not only to the length of time researchers spend in the field. A year or two tends to be the minimum, depending on the locale, topic of study, but also the depth of involvement that you establish with your subject, that there's a real length of time and a real commitment into that community. What about the challenge? You want to develop intimacy, but you don't want to get so close, as they say, go native, and critically accept the perspectives of the people you're talking to. There has to be at least some distance, even as you are sympathetic and hear their stories in depth, that you're understanding that they have a limited perspective, as do you, but you're hopefully bringing enough both theory and different perspectives even within their community that you're getting a more balanced view. But if you're too distant, you may fail to penetrate beyond the fronts people design for public presentation. So there is a strong balance between intimacy and objectivity. Core ethnography will be biased. Researchers will so impose their own opinions, their own history, that they won't even see what's really happening in front of their eyes. And if you become too dependent on a couple of sources within a community, you may fail to get the multiple perspectives of that community, and you may reduce it to a few viewpoints. The other side is if you're not thinking in depth, you'll just see what you expect to see, and weak ethnography will just rediscover the obvious, what was going to be there. You have to think carefully about your research question. That community is not just the story you see, but how it relates to a whole range of thoughts about how culture can operate, operates in different ways, and how this community is different. And that can give you something beyond the obvious. And here's the other thing. It's far easier for researchers to study down, look at the downtrodden, the powerless, the underclass, because they don't have much filters. It's harder to keep researchers out, unlike the powerful, who can insulate themselves and keep people away. So we understand much more about people without power, while those with power are often in a black box in our society. So how do you improve results? You can combine direct observation, your participation, interviews, casual conversation, all put together to triangulate any finding that if all the different parts, all the different ways of getting at data agree, it's far more likely to be true. You also always have to include, almost on a daily basis with ethnography, your methodological reflections. Understanding why you made decisions you did, how that led to your next conversation, and so on, so that you have a running record of your biases and how that may have affected what happened. On the ethical phase, can you ignore informed consent for covert research? Especially if we're talking about how the powerful insulate themselves, is it okay to do some form of covert research where you don't let folks know why you're doing it? Do you have to give data to institutional review boards, especially if that might violate some of the confidentiality you had agreed to with subjects? Should you, after you write your ethnography, bring the data back to the communities you study and ask for feedback? Or will that lead to some kind of censorship on the final result? Finally, you've got data analysis and presentation. Observations about the specifics of a particular time and place must be joined by much more far-reaching general analysis. You have the specifics, but you have to find out why the specifics matter and think deeply about how it fits into the rest of the sociological literature. The real test, have you succeeded in capturing the more general patterns when you can compare it to other comparable settings and recognize the descriptions they read. Ultimately, good ethnography generates, modifies, extends, or challenges existing understandings of social life. And this is a big part of it. You want to vividly present the stories of a community. You want to have colorful words, adjectives, the literary devices that highlight the vibrancy of group culture. This is where the aspects of literature come into a good ethnography. You shouldn't shy away from it. It's just not enough. Finally, here's a good quote for ending this week. As the Adlers say, in making the familiar distant, researchers find new ways of looking at what we think we know and bringing the unknown to light. Weak ethnography runs the risk of rediscovering the obvious.